growing as producers, you're going to run into a completion bond. And as I mentioned, it's kind of a specialty insurance. You know, the big bond, the main bonder here in LA is Film Finances. There's in Europe, there's European Film Bond. There's another company, there was a big company that got merged into Film Finances, but there's a, do you know Steve Mangle? They have a new...
yeah, but the name of the company escapes me.
Yeah, they do. Anyways, at AFM I ran into them and they were happy. They had found another insurance underwriter and they were now again back in the business. It's actually healthy for producers to have multiple parties in that business, because Film Finances is great. They really know what they're doing. They've been doing it forever. But if there's one provider, like any market condition, you know, they have a monopoly, and you know, from a cost standpoint as a producer, they control the market. So it's always healthier for the producer if you have competitive pricing points for the same services. But the completion bond, what they do is, so they sign up, and usually the capital will be the direct beneficiary of the bond. So again, I think I mentioned that a bond is, the basic tenets are that the film's going to be completed on time and on budget. So if you're an investor and you've put your equity at risk, and you look at the track record of the producer, you say, okay, that's great. Along the way you say, well, you know, is the completion bonder going to be happy with you as the producer, and probably more importantly, are they going to be happy with the director? You know, are they going to feel that they have enough comfort or control over the director? And the bond company has a lot of control. They have an ability typically to take over the production, which if you're a producer, last words you ever want to hear, right? And if you're a director, it's even worse, because they have actually, in most cases, the ability to fire the director. And frankly, if those things happen, it's really bad for everybody, including the capital. But if you're the capital, you know, you have other things that may result from that, where you get your money back, or the bond company is contractually required to pay you off. So that these things actually happen. They're not fun, and it usually hurts the movie in a big way, including distribution values, obviously. If you went into a movie telling it was a certain director and suddenly it's not that director, you have a problem. So the bonders, and what they do is they run on a relatively small, you know, office overhead, so they're very good about assessing risk. And then what they really have is they have a great network of production people. So if there is a problem, they oftentimes wouldn't let it get to the point where they had to take it over. They oftentimes would just impose somebody on you as a producer, or daily cost reports. They're really on top of you if they think there's a problem. I had a film years ago that I financed that was a heavy visual effects movie. So, you know, solid producer, really sort of a cutting edge visual effects company at the time. It was a very collaborative visual effects company, almost like a consortium of really high-end individuals. So it all looked really good, and it was a very effects-driven movie. But shortly into the production, you know, it was the kind of movie where effects were very active from the beginning. But shortly into the production, the effects company itself sort of blew apart. So I think the individuals that were these very talented individuals, for some reason decided they didn't want to work together anymore. And here, you know, the whole budget, which the effects was a big part of, was geared off of that specific group. So that's an example of where the bond company then had to try to assess that risk on the front end and say, well, what do we do about this now? So what they did in that case is they really scrambled. They got with the producer, they cobbled together, you know, other people in the effects world, and they got the movie completed, and they got it delivered, and frankly the movie made its money back. So in considering what happened, it was a real success. The movie, in my opinion, was ultimately, you know, damaged because of what happened. So what was supposed to be, you know, super impressive effects were solid, but, you know, probably fell short of where they were aiming. But, you know, it got resolved, and that's exactly why the capital wanted the completion bond to fix those kinds of things without taking a big loss. So
it protects the investor ultimately.
very much so. And you know, studios will sometimes require it. The major studios in the past, a lot of times have been so big that they self-insure. They have their own captive insurance that they use. So they kind of use a different mechanism to get to a similar place. And a lot of really smaller independents, though, you might not run into this. And you know, I don't want to say this in the wrong way, but if you're a producer and the capital isn't asking for it, you know, it's nice in a way, but I would probably say you give yourself more capital opportunities if you offer it, because it's something that the capital is going to say, there's a complete third party that's got, you know, is looking after things on their behalf. For example, even the rights themselves, you know, will at the last minute be put into a separate entity for the production of the movie, and it sometimes then is the core entity that's hiring out and hiring the in-house production personnel. It's sometimes, though, if you have a production services agreement with yet another production services company, they wouldn't be the SPE necessarily, but they might just be contracted by the SPE to provide those production services.
So let's say this company, let's say the movie is, I don't know, the name is Green LLC,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so what happens to it after the film was produced and everything? So how long does it stay alive?
It stays alive for quite a while. You know, oftentimes I think they try to time that to when it's predictably going to have its run of receipts that are coming in. So for example, when you're using soft monies and these production incentives, let's say it could be anywhere from completion of the movie for another 6 to 12 months before you realize those. And then obviously in distribution, Alejandro will talk more about this, you know, later in the day, but if in distribution, when you go out on these windows, they have what's called a first cycle of a film's life. So that's kind of its initial exploitation cycle across all media, basically. And if you think about television, especially free television, that tends to be a longer term contract, whereas, you know, maybe most of the receipts for the whole movie are going to be realized in the first, you know, year or two, but then there's a period maybe going out these days 7-8 years is kind of a reasonable period that to get back to your question, you know, the entity probably will stay in existence somewhat until it captures most of those. Eventually, the rights holder there'll typically be an agreement as to what's going to happen with it. If the investor came in and they said, look, I don't care what happens in the future, I always want to have a controlling interest in this entity, then it may stay alive for a long time. If you're a big company that has many productions going on, at some point you might roll that back up in, you know, when they sort of view it as library, you know, product at that time. They may collapse that entity that was formed for the production back up into the, you know, a larger corporate entity. The main reason they really do this is they want it to be a bankruptcy remote. So let's say you're a big company, when you set this up and you're putting dedicated capital into it, there's a couple things you don't want. You don't want somebody who might make a claim, let's say it's a production services company, or let's say it's talent. You know, they think they weren't paid their proper share of something, or it's the guilds. They make a claim against the entity. You don't want that claim to automatically impact, you know, a parent company that may have other assets that they don't want exposed to that. So they tend to isolate the rights and the process down into this special purpose entity or SPE.
So would you say it's, I mean, if there's a smaller production company that has, let's say, 1-2 productions a year, would you still recommend to do that?
Absolutely, every time.
Every time?
Every time, because there's a great chance. Yeah, it's a risk mitigation. That's the main reason. You're managing your risk, and you know, even if you have the same capital for those 1 or 2 movies during the year, I would still do it, because you're going to end up engaging on each movie. It's you know, as much as people try to standardize things and say it's going to look the same, it always looks different. It always looks just like it does for that movie, and then it looks different for the next one. So there's a point at which they'll be contracting with different parties, of course, and so for that reason alone, you probably always want to do it that way. And I think, you know, back to an earlier comment, you're obviously going to want to have a seasoned production attorney, and you know, there are people out there that are very capable on all the production legal work, which would include this, but they're also capable on the financing legal work. So they kind of see how the pieces all connect. But you know, I'm not a lawyer, but you know, I have dealt with hundreds of lawyers over the years, and you know, I hate to say this, sometimes as painful as it feels, you know, they really tend to do a very protective, you know, job for the producer.
Thank you.
It's more of a legal question, but if you have made a movie and you haven't created a special entity for it, is that possible to create later on another one and transfer the right to it?
Yeah, I think it would be. I mean, you just have, yeah, it probably is. It's just a question of what you have protected versus what's unprotected at that point. And a lawyer is going to be better at advising you of, you know, what benefit you might not be getting by doing it later like that. There will be some protections that you're probably not getting by doing that later.
I have a question about raising initial funds, because I'm sure the producers or future producers in this room are probably mostly interested in, I mean, you touched on, you know, the kind of types of, you know, equity that is available for producers. But for instance, you work with the funds, right? Let's say someone comes to you. How do they attract your attention? How do they have you invest into their?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think you know, there's probably, and that we can also talk about that more after the break. But I would say that you know, there's probably a core package of things that most capital are looking for. So obviously you have a script, but I would encourage everybody, and you've probably all done this in some form already, where you start to summarize the information about the project. So you have a synopsis of the script, and you know, and storyline. Maybe you have a storyline and then a separate, you know, 1 or 2 page synopsis. You want something that can both attract the initial reader, but maybe you never know with the capital is the truth until you're in the conversation. You may think that you've given them exactly the right thing, and they didn't spend the time on it. Or you may think that they only wanted a little bit, but they want to see more. So you kind of need to approach it. I always think of it in layers. So it's kind of like, start with your summary information, have your sort of next layer of detail ready, and you know, go as far as you can with that. And you know, sometimes just based on the timing of the project, you don't know everything at that point, but you're planning for it. So it's a little bit like making a business plan, but I've seen hundreds of business plans for an individual film, and you know, there's a point at which I think you really don't get the value out of the business plan itself either, because you kind of past what's reliable informationally. So, but if you have, you know, storyline, synopsis, you know, obviously producer, if you can, the more you can talk about experience, track record, absolutely do it. And you know, sometimes I'll give you an example. If you're a producer that just, you know, has little or no credits yet, and you're able to attract a project that you control where, you know, you have a really strong line producer. That's you know, surround yourself. You have to. It's such a collaborative thing that if you, as much as you might want to control it, it's probably better to try to trust people that are more seasoned and surround yourself with them when you can, because that then as a package, you know, starts to be something when capital looks at it, an investor looks at it, they say, well, you know, let me look on IMDb. Let me look at, you know, and they see people with credits and hope if they're relevant to the same kind of project you're making, even better. So you have the sort of people involved, you know, you'd be surprised how important sometimes things like, you know, production designer are. You know, depending on the project, if it's an action movie, you know, stunt coordinator, you know, second unit director, and you might have a young director but a great first AD. So, you know, think about as all those people when you're going to talk to capital, you know, become important, and you don't know until you're in the conversation with the capital whether it's that important to them. So you're always sort of playing a game of balancing what you think is the ideal thing for your project, and then you're doing kind of a cost-benefit analysis of, okay, well, if I'm gonna vary from that, let's do it in a way where it's at least as attractive, if not more attractive, you know, to capital. And again, there's so many moving parts in that, especially people-wise, because, you know, the person you want, you just, for a variety of reasons, might not get them. Right? So you have to have your short list, and you have to be constantly lining all those things up and seeing what can get the thing made and still something that you're going to want to spend a couple years of your life doing, which is not unimportant.
Yeah, it's always a catch-22, right?
Yeah.
Because for me as an independent producer, I always run into the same problem.
Yeah.
You want to finance your project. To finance your project, you have to have attachments.
Mm-hmm.
But to get the attachments, you have to have the capital. So that's basically what.
And you know, similar things happen in all kinds of business. I mean, with you putting a fund together,
Mm-hmm.
you have a different version of that unfolds. Is, you know, you're trying ideally to raise a pool of capital, but you don't actually have commitments from individual movies. So you're trying to say, oh, you know, and frankly, when you see people running around with a collection of movies, you know, it's something capital becomes very suspect of, because if they know what they're looking at, they have to wonder, well, you know, if they're really that attractive as commercial, you know, projects, how are you holding all the people together, you know, to do 20 projects that you can name? I mean, a major studio typically can't do that. You know, they can't get out past the first, you know, 18 months in their case. And on the independent side, you know, you'd be lucky if you could, you know, hold something together for more than 6 months just to, you know, get it pulled together. So you know, you're always trying, for funds, you're sort of saying, can we sort of get what's called a blind pool of capital, where we don't know what the projects are going to be, but we try to convince them in other ways that we're going to create these parameters for ourselves, and everything that we do has to kind of fit in there. But same thing, and then similarly, you don't know what the capital wants or what kind of terms they're going to get. So again, for the producer, it's good to look at, I would focus on, you know, obviously you've heard it 1,000 times, you know, great story, you know, great script. And from there, you know, focus on who's it being made for. You know, if you can't answer that, if smart capital, that should be like one of their first questions. Who's the movie made for? And then secondly, how are you going to reach that audience? And this is then you get into the whole conversation of, you know, there are ways to reach the audience today that weren't available previously, but you still need to have a well thought out path, you know, to get it there. And then you get into the details, at which point you may think of it, for example, a typical, this is worth talking about, a typical independent project, the way the sort of upside works. We all would hope at some point to find upside. A lot of films don't get to upside, but a lot of times what happens is, just think of, without overly labeling everybody, think of the money and the producer, right? And the producer would include usually the creative talent team. So, or the money and the rights holders, is probably a better way to say it. So, a lot of times the money will want its money recovered first, obviously before you're getting into profits. And typically in the independent world, the upside is split 50-50, half to the money and half to the creative team or the production team. So then you have a lot of negotiations within that you have to make as to who gets what, within that. But that basically is a one paradigm that tends to hold up. Obviously there are exceptions, and it's all situational. So certain money may say, I need this, and certain producers may say, I'm just going to wait until I find the right money to do it this way. So it's always a challenge. You want to end up with the best product. You want to end up with something that's going to make all the people that put their sweat and tears into the thing, have it make sense. And at the same time, you're trying to be a business person and find a path to get the capital and to hopefully get it back. Because the best thing you can do is recoup the capital. Because I guarantee you, life only gets better once you make somebody their money back. And even if it's not them, you hope that you're doing that and they're so happy about that they want to go do it again. And because then everything becomes more efficient, right? You don't have to have all the starting conversations in the same way. But even if it's not them, if you can point to the next investor and say, I got that money back, and they can they'll verify it. They wouldn't say I didn't get my money back if they did. So investors are very happy if they get their money back.